Good morning. I am actually on. Yeah, there we go. Fantastic. So, because people like to analyse sort of everything nowadays, don't they? Someone somewhere has done a bit of data collecting on sort of various, I guess, military funerals, that kind of thing, to look up which verses are sort of used the most, I guess. And probably no surprising to sort of many of us is that the clicker doesn't work. Is the first thing that is not... oh, there we go. Is that this verse is used the most in funerals. As one Mark read out earlier, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And probably across the country today, as there's many sort of remembrance services, this verse is probably going to be used more than any other. And these words, they come from John 15, and it's where Jesus is teaching his disciples about not only the kind of love he has for them, but sort of the love that they ought to have for each other. A love so great they're willing to pay love's ultimate price, the giving of their own lives for another, or a cause greater than themselves. And that's sort of what the word sacrifice ultimately means. An act of giving up something valued for the sake of something else regarded as more important or worthy. It was, of course, sort of what Jesus did himself, isn't it? It's his sort of life that he lived by. He was a young man in his prime, 30 years of age, just a bit older than myself, at the time of his death. His passion for God, God's kingdom, to see others welcomed in. He was willing to give his life for it. And as we all know, he did that on a cross. Our very belief is sort of founded around this very thing, Jesus giving his life for others so that they might themselves live. It's also the way as well that we see and read that his disciples lived, that came after him. And if you sort of read into it, all bar sort of John ended up giving their lives for this course. They lived this sacrificial way of life. And it's no wonder then that from that time until this, probably these words are used at sort of events and sort of military funerals, all those kinds of things, where someone has given their life for someone else. Now, as I've sort of grown older, I've thought about this a little bit more, what it means to sacrifice. And in doing this, I've grown a little bit more in appreciation for those who have sacrificed so that we might have the life that we have today. Especially poignant, I think, what Mark did earlier, when people were sort of saying past relatives that have read out. And at the same time watching sort of all the kids sort of moving around at the front, especially the three of them are mine. And sort of thinking, actually, those that have given their lives there have done that so that, and they wouldn't even know my kids, but so that they can actually have the freedom that they have today. And it's a really sort of powerful thing, just to sit and listen and watch while that was happening. Some of you might know this. Some of you might know this. I actually come from a family which I realised the other day, well, not the other day, but a few years ago, but it sort of came back to me the other day, that I'm the first generation from both sides of my family which hasn't served in the armed force. My great-granddads both served in the war. My granddads served in some capacity in the military as well. And my dad served and fought for about 10 years, sort of over in Ireland and other places. So I've grown up with this massive respect for those that sort of put themselves in the line of fire, as it were, of others. However, as I've sort of looked into it a bit more, I can never fully grasp or experience what they've been through or witnessed for others. Never really known what it truly is to put my life on the line for someone else. And I shared a little bit of this last week on Sunday evening with the young people. But I've lived and grown up with a dad who, thankfully, his life was not taken while he served. But he has suffered for sort of many years with the trauma of what he saw and witnessed over in Ireland, Northern Ireland, in the 70s. Many of you sort of have read stuff about what happens over there. The result of it, he did lose part of himself out there, at least mentally. And over the years, I've watched him as he struggled to come to terms with all it with all he saw out there. And often he was in and out of hospitals trying to deal with it all in some way, trying to process it. And it's probably only been the last 5-6 years, as he's drawn closer to God, which probably won't surprise anyone, he started to cope better with it. And although he never really talks about it in any way over the years, we don't really know what he saw out there or what he witnessed out there. Apart from one story, which he did offer up. And he offered it up when I was about 17. And at the time, I was in college doing an engineering course and living in Oxford. And for those of you who don't sort of know Oxford very well, it's sort of surrounded by military bases. There's sort of a couple of RAF bases. There's a couple of sort of military bases. There's various housing estates that are just dedicated to families that have those serving as well, so that they can live there. And sort of if you're doing engineering in Oxford, the two main routes for you are you get an apprenticeship with an engineering firm that provides parts for the military bases and the military vehicles, or you yourself sign up to be a sort of royal engineer. And they were sort of the two routes. And actually out of my class, there was 20 on our class, all 19 of them went into one of those two routes, me being the 20th and obviously not doing either of those things. But that was just the route it was. And I considered both of those routes as well, and was considering, the army engineers at one point as well. And one Saturday, my dad sort of came in to my room and spoke to me. And most of you have met my dad. You know he's quite quiet. He doesn't offer a lot of conversation. And he came in and he wanted to have a chat with me. And he explained to me he knew I was looking at the options and what those options were. And he asked me to think about it properly. And said to me, if you go into the army, you offer up every part of your life for others. It's a huge cost to give up your entire life for others. He then brought out this tin. There it is. That isn't his tin, but it's one exactly the same. And he showed it to me. Now, my dad's tin has, it looks like this, although it's a bit more battered. And just in the middle of where it says gold block, he has a hole that's probably about the size of a 5-pence piece, probably a little bit bigger in there, in the lid. And he opened it up, and inside was this. That's the laser. There we go. Was this bullet. Again, it's not the same one, but it is very similar. And he told me the story that while he was out on patrol in Northern Ireland, that his patrol was surprised by a group of RAA terrorists at the time. And they got pinned down, and they came under quite heavy gunfire. And for the next hour, there was sort of a little bit of a battle going on between himself and others. And he saw one of his people he was on patrol with took a bullet to the leg, and he saw him go down as well. And he said all he had for the next hour was a bit of a blur, because he could just hear whistling, and which was sort of various bullets flying over the top of his head. When it all died down, they were checking around for civilians and just sort of looking around. And one of the other guys he was on patrol with sort of looked at my dad, and I have changed the language to which my dad expressed what happened to him in there. But essentially they said, "John, your chest, are you all right?" And my dad looked down, and sticking out of his breast pocket was this bullet. It was half sticking out of him. And as they sat him down and they took it off because they thought he'd actually been hit, they opened up his jacket, and they realised that it had gone through the jacket, but it hadn't pierced the skin in any way. Apparently it ricocheted off something and gone into him. The reason it hadn't gone into him is that in his top breast pocket he kept his tobacco tin, which is the tin from earlier, and it had actually got stuck into that, and apparently it saved his life, which to this day my dad will still claim is proof that smoking does save lives in some way, which is just his excuse for using his pipe, I think. But nevertheless, it's a scary thing to think that just a couple of centimetres from death in some way. And I can never experience that. Many of us can never experience that in some way. And my dad at the time said, "Think carefully what you're willing to give your life for," and then sort of walked off, as he does. And it's the only story me, my sister, my mum really know about his army days in any way. Having said this, though, I've started wondering have we forgotten the real meaning of sacrifice? It's rarely spoken about in some churches because it is a hard subject. Perhaps we hear about it maybe at Easter time. But other than that, it's not a very nice one. The thought of giving up everything so someone else can benefit goes against our very selfish human desires in some way. And just, for me as well, has it been watered down, what sacrifice actually means? And the thought, maybe, or it conjures up other thoughts of maybe Old Testament sacrifices. Or nowadays you have various games or films that look at the issue of sacrifice. Those of you might have seen sort of the Hunger Games over the past years, or Game of Thrones as well. But often there's the whole issue of sacrifice that comes up there. But also, when I typed into Google sacrifice, which don't do, but this came up. A lot of these little quotes. This one says sacrifice for pleasure. And it's a lot of the quotes looked at sacrifice, but not for others, but for ourselves. It looked at actually sacrificing something for our own gain. Which is why it's made me think, actually, have we lost the meaning of what sacrifice actually is? Have we watered it down in some way? Because how many times have we actually been in situations which requires us to give up something to help someone else? It might not be our lives, but it might be something a little bit smaller. And the thought of, well, what about me? Or, I'm just too tired. Or thoughts of that sort of vein have come into our heads. And hear me though, I'm not saying we constantly should be giving out, constantly sacrificing all the time. But if everyone is sacrificing things for other people, then hopefully you get this sort of big circle of everyone sacrificing for each other in some way. And I came across this quote. So hopefully, no, the wrong way. Which you probably can't. Hopefully, some of you might see. But it sort of sums up perfectly what sacrifice is, and it's about a book called From Justifiable Pride, which recounts the experience of a guy called William Stevens who served in World War II and went through the ordeal of sort of being captured and ended up in a prisoner of war camp and managed to even survive that as well. This is an extract from the last bit of his book. It says, "Once in a while, lying in a comfortable bed, clean, warm and well fed, I recall the countless nights of being a prisoner of war. But those days are long gone and don't come readily to mind, except when the band plays our national anthem before a football game. Then standing bareheaded with my hand over my heart, watching the stars and stripes wave in the breeze, I think about World War II and those who participated in it. Each of us, while performing the role assigned to him, gave up the right to pursue the other goals, to go where he wanted to go and seek fulfillment in his own way. That's why our wartime service was so meaningful. We were doing something for others, something above and beyond ourselves, something from which we had nothing to gain and much to lose. That's why taking part in it is justifiable. This is our recompense for the sacrifices we made, for the hardships we endured. Those were not our happiest years, nor our most rewarding, but they are years none of us will ever forget. But as we alone know, in some ways, they were our greatest years." See, sacrifice, it isn't about us, which I know sounds maybe quite obvious. But true sacrifice, to truly give it all up, requires us to put ourselves in a position where we do give up maybe our own dreams, our own goals, to lose it all so that someone else might gain everything. We can sit here and go, yes, let's do it, let's throw a lot in, I'm going to give my all to that person, or I'm going to give my all to even the church, or to whatever situation we might be, to chuck it all in for that situation. But it's not an easy thing. No one sacrifices easily. I'm sure William Stevens, as insightful as his views are on sacrificing, struggled along with all those that go off to war, with putting it all on the line. You only have to watch sort of countless videos or read the stories of soldiers leaving loved ones today even, or soldiers perhaps greeting their newborn via Skype for the first time, to see the true pain of giving it all up for something bigger. The cost of sacrifice is never a small one. And I'd go as far to say that if you are sacrificing or think you're sacrificing and it's easy, then perhaps it's not sacrificing in some way. And Jesus himself even found this whole issue of sacrificing hard. We know he was nailed on the cross and he did it, and we like to think of that as what a wonderful thing he did for us, and it was. But he himself, as we know, fully God, fully human, struggled with this in his human self. And it's the story, as some of you know, that Jesus in the garden before he was arrested ended up going and praying to God. It says this: Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed. "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he rose from prayer and went back to his disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. "Why are you sleeping?" he asked them. "Get up and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation." Now, sweating blood is actually a medical thing. I can't say its name, but it's up there. And apparently it's a very rare condition in which an individual sweats blood. And it occurs in an individual who's suffering from extreme levels of stress. And there are lots of other factors that they say contribute to it, but the main ones are intense fear and mental contemplation as being the most frequent causes of this condition. Now, Jesus knew what he was about to do. He knew the scriptures. He knew what God was asking him to do, to give up his entire life, sacrifice it all, so that others can live. Now, in Isaiah, it says, "His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness." Jesus knew this. He knew that this was written about him, and that this is what he was going to have to go through for us all. But he struggled. Deep anguish. Giving up one's life is never an easy thing, and we have to be so sure of what we are willing to give our lives for. Now, I wonder if there are any of us here, perhaps, who have ever thought or contemplated what circumstances and for whom they might be willing to give their lives. And of course, as we live here and as we were sharing earlier, we almost rarely get to give our lives intentionally, spontaneously, immediately, like those that have gone before us perhaps did. We have the freedom nowadays in this country that we don't have to perhaps think about these things. And almost never, if ever, do we have to say, "Here, take my life instead," or in place of someone else. In fact, a good case can be made that we most often sacrifice our lives for others, not by actually dying, but by actually living, or how we live. And as sort of Mark shared a little bit earlier as well, some of those ways could be perhaps a parent who loves their kids night and day. As a parent, and as many of you have been parents, I'm sure you know the sacrifices that have to be made for your children. A co-worker willing to step in to help another through a difficult situation. A spouse who takes care of an ailing companion. A son or daughter watches over a physically or mentally failing parent. Dedicated professionals, perhaps, such as teachers, pastors, nurses, physicians, politicians, for example, who give themselves all up for their students, parishioners, patients, or constituents. Those who work in physically dangerous situations, who put themselves in danger to help others, like all the emergency services we have, the fire, the police, the ambulance services. What determines whether a life is laid down in love is not so much whether we live or die, but why we do it and for whom. And that's why I think that verse that we read out at the start is quoted so often. Greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their lives for their friends. We all have things in our lives, people, situations, that while we might not be in the position of giving our lives, there are situations that we have to sacrifice something for someone else. So, for all of us on this day of remembrance, I'd like us to remember those that have fought as it is right, so we don't forget. And those that have sacrificed as well, so that we can have this freedom. But also let ourselves think about what sacrifices are we making in our lives so that others can gain and walk in freedom, as Christ did the very same thing for us. And what I'd like to do is just invite the band back up. And there's this song I've been listening to quite a lot this week called This Is Amazing Grace. I think it's a relatively new-ish song that's come out. But what we're going to do is the band are just going to play it. And we're not going to sing it to start with. They're just going to play it all the way through. And as they do, I want us... No. Go back. As they just play it through, if we just remain in our seats, and I'd just like us to think about the sacrifices. What sacrifices are we making in our lives so that others can gain and walk in freedom? But also, let us just remember as well and think about those perhaps that have sacrificed things for us. Not just those that have fought, but perhaps it might be a parent that's given you a lot, or someone else. But just have a little think about those that have sacrificed for us and those that we are sacrificing for. And then as the band plays it through, we'll end by singing it.
Stand and sing together. Who breaks the power of sin and darkness, whose love is mighty and so much stronger, the King of glory, the King above all kings, who shakes the whole earth with holy thunder, who leaves us breathless in all is amazing grace.